this is gonna turn some people's heads.
Screw it.
Just a little quick something I have for you guys. Some spicy hot takes for movies that are more than likely going to put me in cinephile jail, if there is such a category or such a thing that exists. Well, if there is, and I've been known to ruffle a few feathers in the past, why stop there when I can already do it again and get some people talking? I'm not meaning this in any way to stick the finger to anybody who feels differently than I do, but I feel the need to maybe get more of my voice out there and maybe cause some cognitive dissonance, because there's already enough people who feel certain ways about these things that I'm about to bring up. But if there's any one of you watching who happens to have some kind of an open mind, welcome to the club. These are not going to be long explanations. I'm going to try to condense them as tightly as I can, but I can't promise anything else. With all that out of the way,
Shall we begin?
the first big one is that Rocky V, while the worst of the franchise, is actually not that bad.
What did you say?
Just hear me out here. I will agree, it is the weakest of all the films that have come out since 1976, including the Creed films, even though in that category there's not a single bad one in there. As far as what came before that though, with the Rocky series, this was considered a low point by the fan base. And to get some of the obvious negatives out of the way, I am not a fan of Tommy Gunn. I think he's very one-note and an unnecessary foil in Rocky's side. While I do like the idea of Rocky training somebody else since he's now at a point where he doesn't need to fight anymore, we don't really know much about Tommy Gunn and what he's all about and what drives him to become a boxer, outside of the fact that he wants Rocky to train him. Why? At least with some of the other boxers that Rocky is opposed to, we at least have enough of an understanding as to why they are in the fight. And his promoter in the film, George Washington Duke, played by Richard Grant, an unnecessary side character that doesn't need to be in there. I know that you need to have some kind of foil in there, but for me, that character is way too overkill. But really the strongest point for me is when he's brought back to his roots after he loses all of his money. I think in a way it's a realistic look on how life can really beat you down, and sometimes you do have to go back to what you know in order to find your footing again. Was it done in the smoothest way possible? Not really. But I do like the idea of it in theory, and I think some of it does actually work really well, as far as the emotional weight behind it. It's overshadowed, though, by everything else. And with all the other additions in the series, I can understand why this was seen as a big step down. And on the one hand, it does do something different than the other films did before this, and certainly afterward, where there's no big fight in the boxing ring. There are some in the movie, yes, but the climactic fight is a street fight. It's a conflicting opinion for me. I kind of like it, but at the same time, I kind of don't. And don't get me wrong, I have no love for Rocky V, but is it the abomination that people have made it out to be? Absolutely not. Would I put it in the same level as the original film? No chance in hell. Realistically, on its own, I would say it's pretty mid. Nothing amazing, but nothing too offensive. But as far as Rocky franchise standards, yeah, it's pretty bad. And another big one that I know some people are not gonna like, and I have never honestly been a fan of this one, is that Rogue One is overrated and forgettable.
Whoa! 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 I felt the ground shake. I felt the ground shake.
Do I think this is a bad movie? No way. It's certainly much better than Attack of the Clones and Phantom Menace. Better than Revenge of the Sith? No. I think Revenge of the Sith is better than this one. And I'm gonna go as far as to say this, I think the whole sequel trilogy, regardless of all the problems I have with some of them, is much better than this movie. The first 2/3 of Rogue One are very clunky and messy, and it's really hard to get invested in the characters, at least on my end. And the common counter-argument I hear from a lot of its fans is that that was the point. It was supposed to be hollow characterization. You're not supposed to feel sorry for them. People will go into certain movies wanting different things, but on the other hand, I think that's a really stupid counterpoint. Just me, though. Forget about the Andor TV show for a second. I know that has its fans, but on its own, what can you really tell me about each character? Jyn Erso, Cassian Andor, Chirrut Imwe, Blaze, or Baze? Probably Baze. You see, that's the problem. None of the main characters are memorable, except for maybe K2SO. Darth Vader only has 2 or 3 moments in this entire thing, and his scene in the finale is probably the most memorable part. The closest that we get is some backstory with Jyn Erso in the opening, that she's the daughter of Galen Erso, who created the flaw in the Death Star, the exhaust port. But the movie jumps a huge amount in time from the time she's a child when she's discovered by Saw Gerrera. And then all this stuff happens in that time jump, and we're never told anything of merit that happened to her in that time frame. Now, in some cases, you're able to fill the gaps in your minds, like that time jump in Avengers Endgame, and how the landscape looks around the Avengers, and how the world adapted after the blip. And in the case of The Last of Us, with Joel losing his daughter Sarah, and then jumping to 20 years, and when we see his interactions with other people, we do get enough of an understanding as to why he is the way he is, and we learn little bits of what he did in that 20-year time span. We don't really get any of that with Jyn Erso. And the only thing that we get from Cassian Andor is that he's been in this fight since he was 6 years old, and that Jin's not the only one who lost everything. And even with Chirrut and his buddy, we get some hint of a backstory, but that's about it. Riz Ahmed's character, all we know about him is that he's the pilot. The point I'm trying to make here is that none of the characters here are memorable. Maybe for some people they are. I'm not taking that away from you. But that's why there wasn't so much hype for Andor. Outside of the fans of Rogue One, nobody really remembers the characters from Rogue One. If I mention the name Cassian Andor to anybody who casually knows Star Wars, I tell them what they look like, and then after about 5 seconds they say, oh yeah, that guy. That's not a good sign. With all the problems the sequel trilogy has, people at least remember Rey, Finn, Poe, and Kylo Ren. But the movie does make up for it in the third act with the climactic battle over Scarif. Is that the name of the planet? Correct me if I'm wrong. And then the space battle above the planet, which I still maintain is the best space battle that Star Wars has showed us since Return of the Jedi. Aesthetically, the movie is top notch. I mean, it's literally right before the events of the original trilogy start, so I imagine with the budget that they have, it's not too hard to pull off. As for Governor Tarkin's look, I don't really need to go into that, but at times it is very distracting. So when I hear people say that it's the best Star Wars has ever been since the original trilogy, or the best one since Empire Strikes Back, I'm all for different perspectives on entertainment. But honestly, I'm actually kind of baffled that people say that. Similar to Rocky V, is this an atrocity? No, absolutely not. But the movie doesn't work for me because of the hollow characters. To be honest, it kind of reminds me of how people hype up Empire so much. Anytime they list that and this movie as their favorite Star Wars film, I always go, yeah, tell me something I don't already know. Again, if you like it, more power to you, but for me, not so much. Now we're getting into the thick of it. Peter 2 stopping Peter 1 from killing the Green Goblin is a more impactful moment than Peter 3 saving Zendaya's MJ. This is going to be intertwined with my next hot take that I got coming up in a minute, but to sum it up, everybody talks about how emotional they felt with Peter 3 saving Zendaya's MJ, and with the rooftop scene where all three Peter Parkers are talking about their past regrets, and how they're relating to Peter 1, Tom Holland's Spider-Man, to the credit of the writers and Andrew Garfield's performance, they do manage to sell the emotion on that one. And while I do feel some little bit of emotion when he saves MJ and he realizes what he was able to do, ultimately it's not really there because of how the relationship was handled in the two solo films, but we're gonna get to that in a minute. Whereas with Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, Peter 2, ever since Norman Osborn died at his own hand, he spent years and years of his life despairing over that. And also it led to Harry and Peter being estranged from each other, and Harry's eventual death. Now that he's in an alternate timeline where Norman Osborn is still alive, he realizes that he has a chance to correct that wrong. And with Peter 3 on the rooftop, he said that he stopped pulling his punches, that he got rageful and bitter. That is an intriguing idea to see how he might have dealt with the death of Gwen Stacy in the aftermath of all that, but we don't really get a glimpse of it through a flashback or anything. Whereas with Peter 2, we saw him not pull his punches with Sandman while he was in the black suit, and with Harry in the penthouse. Heck, even with Spider-Man 1 when he chased down Dennis Carradine, we saw how far that he could have gone had he let his anger control him. And thanks to the wisdom that his Aunt May taught him in Spider-Man 3, he now knows that revenge is not worth it. Makes it all the more cathartic when he stops Peter 1 from throwing the glider into Norman Osborn's body. No words spoken, but Tobey's face says it all. Don't do it. This is not worth it. And that leads us into the Peter and Gwen romance in the Amazing Spider-Man series. The Peter and Gwen romance is bland and boring.
Hold on tight! This is gonna be bad!
No! No! Does not compute! Does not compute! It does not compute!
I got a video on that coming up in the future. I can't say exactly when I'm gonna put it up, but I do have it in production. Well, at least on my iMovie editor, so if that counts for the word of production. What's the matter with me? Not gonna go too deep into it here, so you'll just have an appetizer before the main course. The big problem with Peter and Gwen for me, first of all, Gwen is the one making the moves on Peter. One of the biggest things in the Spider-Man lore is that he's trying to get the girl's attention. And pretty much from the first scene when she interacts with him or has any acknowledgement of him, she's the one throwing herself at him. I mean, not to mention the fact that Andrew's Peter Parker looks like the cool guy instead of the shy, reclusive nerd that Tobey and even to a point Tom Holland had in their own separate portrayals. If he looked and acted like Tobey Maguire, there's no way she would have been interested in him. And up until their first kiss on the rooftop, their interactions are practically non-existent. All they really do is flirt with each other, not really forming full sentences. Basically, they don't have a conversation. They don't really get to know each other that well. It's just them making googly eyes at each other. Whereas in the original film with Peter and MJ, they actually took their time to develop the connection between the two. And by the end of it, MJ was able to realize why she falls in love with Peter. That's a realistic take on how a romance builds between two people. One counter argument I hear with Peter and Gwen is that it's realistic that teenagers would get together like that. Yeah, okay, but that doesn't exactly make for good storytelling. If you want to have a compelling romance, you need to build the connection between the two, have them talk to each other, and then by the time they kiss each other, then it feels like a worthy build-up. And by the time they get together, they actually have conversations with each other. Where was that before you had your romantic moment on the roof? Don't even get me started on how they go back and forth in Amazing Spider-Man 2. To sum it up as quickly as I can so we can save the rest for later, it's always a will they, won't they. She wants to break up with him, he wants to be with her, he wants to break up with her, but she wants to be with him. And when he repeatedly told her to stay put, she willingly puts herself in danger. Now, I'm not against women making their own choices, that's not what I'm talking about. But the problem I have with it is that it absolves Peter of any guilt and shame that he feels over Gwen's death. That was a big thing in the comics, that he blamed himself for not being able to save Gwen Stacy. And the fact that she literally walks out into the open when the Green Goblin shows up, she's the valedictorian of her high school class. If she really was that smart, wouldn't she think, maybe I shouldn't go out there, maybe I should just take cover until this whole thing blows over? And if all these thought that Peter Parker was an oblivious idiot in Spider-Man 3, I think Gwen is a lot worse in that category. Well, I got a lot more to say about that, but we'll save that for another time. But here's the big one for me, and it's yet another Star Wars take. The Force Awakens is the best Star Wars film since the original trilogy.
Rape my childhood, will you? You'll all die! You will all die!
I have felt this way ever since I saw it nearly a decade ago. After how the prequels went down in between the original and the sequel trilogy, all of us fans who didn't feel so great about the prequels, even though they had their fans, we were craving for something that felt like the originals again. And while this film to this day still has its detractors, that it's too much like A New Hope or that it's a remake or some retread, there are some similarities, yes, but it was a necessary evil to get people back on board, to remind the audience this is the Star Wars that you remember. I mean, we can talk about how Disney handled it with how they were catering to the prequel haters, and they were catering to the haters of The Force Awakens with The Last Jedi and rinse, slide, repeat, and all that other crap. But outside of all that fan service stuff, I think that we have a very compelling first act of a trilogy. Regardless of how it turned out with the later two entries, I think the setup for Rey, Finn, and Poe, well, mostly with Rey and Finn and Kylo Ren actually, there was something there that drew us in and made us ask questions. What's the deal with Rey? How did she end up on Jakku? Who is her family? Finn used to be a stormtrooper. We never saw that before in Star Wars. Rey's situation is very similar to Luke's situation in A New Hope, where they both longed for something better. The difference is, Luke was eager to go out into the galaxy. Rey wanted to go, but she wanted to wait just in case her family decided to come back if they were still alive. But deep down she knows that that's not true. And then her connection with Kylo Ren or Ben Solo, that adds further depth to this movie and for the rest of the trilogy. And Kylo Ren is nothing like Darth Vader. He's the opposite of Anakin Skywalker. Ben was naturally light, but wants to be in the dark. Anakin was naturally dark, but wanted to be in the light. And he rationalizes in his mind that killing his father is the only way that's going to push him further into the darkness. But of course, that doesn't happen when we see his immediate reaction afterward. Finn is not eager to join the fight of the Resistance. He wants to get away from the First Order as quickly as possible, but his connection to Rey ends up drawing him back into the fight. Han Solo is not a wise old Jedi like Obi-Wan was. He does mentor Rey in a way, yes, and even Finn, but not in the same ways that Obi-Wan did with Luke, or Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan did with Anakin back in the day. In a way, it actually changes up the formula. It doesn't follow it beat by beat. I mean, to go into all the reasons why, I'm going to be here all day explaining all that to you, but if you're curious, check out the Goldman's videos on the sequel trilogy. He's actually a big advocate of them, while also pointing out the problems he has with them. And with J.J. Abrams directing, he's clearly a fan of the source material, and he's very passionate about it. Can't really say that about most blockbuster filmmakers out there. And the music by John Williams, who is never a disappointment in the least bit. And saving the final scene to show us Luke Skywalker was a brave and smart move. Because not having him show up in the trailers until then, it made all the wait worth it. And dare I say it, besides Return of the Jedi, Force Awakens is my favorite film in the entire Star Wars saga, and I will die on that hill.